Jim Wilson had just wrapped up a grueling business meeting. It did not go well. He had been on the road for over 3 weeks now, trying to earn his Salesman of the Year award and a much-needed cash bonus. Jim needed a drink. A few drinks, as a matter of fact. He rushed downstairs to the hotel lobby and finally exhaled as he entered the lounge. "Gin and tonic, my man, and please don't spare the alcohol," he exclaimed to the bartender. Just as Jim took his first sip, he felt a tap on his shoulder. "Do you mind if I join you?" a sultry voice whispered in his right ear. Jim turned around to find in front of him an angel. Dark, shapely, gorgeous, and with a pair of pouty lips that could not be denied. Maybe this day is not so bad after all. Jim slowly slipped his wedding ring into the pocket of his pants and offered the woman a seat next to him. "I'm Jim. What's your name, gorgeous?" "Angel," she replied. How perfect is this, Jim thought to himself. Angel looked sad. Jim kept chugging down his gin and tonics as if they were water. Angel began to tell him of her brother who lives in her native country of Colombia. He is in the hospital and has been waiting for a kidney transplant for 6 months now, but to no avail. As a tear rolled down the side of her face, she turned to Jim and said, "He only has a week to live." Just as Jim sipped his 12th drink, Angel asked, "Would you like to take a bath together?" Jim, shocked, paused for a quick second, then said with a silly grin on his face, "Why, I'd be delighted to." Excited, Jim slammed down the rest of his drink, and the two rushed up to his room. Getting in the bathtub is the last thing Jim remembered before waking up early the next morning. He was still in the bathtub, his body, completely submerged in ice from the neck down, felt completely numb. A phone was placed next to him, on top of the ice. As he looked up, he saw a big note with the following instructions written in lipstick. "Do not move. Call 911 for an ambulance now." Jim, who could not move anything but his hands, knocked over the phone handset, pressed the speakerphone button, and immediately dialed 911. An ambulance arrived within minutes. The medics carefully pulled Jim out of the bathtub and gasped in horror. "Have you recently had a surgery, Mr. Wilson?" the medic asked. "No," replied Jim. "Why do you ask?" The medic reached behind Jim and pulled a tube which was protruding from his lower back. As they turned Jim around, the medics' faces were as white as the wall behind them. The scene was bloody. One of the medics, in shocking disbelief, fell to the floor and passed out. Jim's back had been cut wide open. The other medic, barely holding on to consciousness, said in a faint voice, "Mr. Wilson, your kidneys are gone."
Muriel lived alone in an old Victorian house overlooking the rocky coast of Maine. She had grown lonely in her old age and relied heavily on the comforts of her Newfoundland, Misty. Misty had taken to sleeping under Muriel's antique canopy bed, and because of the bed's height, his furry body just fit underneath. All his treasures awaited him beneath the metal springs. Bones, toys, biscuits, and riches of all kinds. Muriel catered to his very fanciful whims, as she had no children to love. Every night, before going to sleep, Muriel would take down her long gray hair and brush each strand over and over again until it shines like the moon, she would say. Misty would sit below her with his head peering out from the bed. After she brushed her own hair, she would take the doggy brush from the bedside table and brush Misty's bushy locks. Misty would fall asleep every night as she performed this ritual. Every morning, Muriel would wake and put her hand underneath the bed. Misty would greet her with a gentle lick on her hand, and Muriel would know that she was safe. Nobody visited Muriel except for the occasional postal worker and paper boy, though she had recently taken to listening to the radio for news stories as her eyes grew weaker and weaker with age. One particular night, Muriel could not sleep. She awoke to a dreadful sound. Drip, drip, drip. This monotonous noise continued to keep Muriel from her dreams. She rose from her bed and went to the bathroom to check the faucets. One faucet appeared to have a slight leak. She turned the knobs tightly, then returned to her bed. The next morning, Muriel put her hand under the bed as she did every morning. She felt Misty's strong tongue lick her hand. As she got up, she began talking to Misty as she often did, reciting the coming events for the day. Muriel put on her bathrobe and slippers and walked slowly down the curvy velvet-covered staircase to her kitchen. As she walked, she heard the familiar noise of her leaky faucet. Drip, 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 over and over again. As she approached the kitchen, the noise got louder. Drip, drip, drip. She turned on the light switch. Hanging by his tongue from the light fixture was Misty. His blood was dripping onto the floor. Drip, drip, drip. And there on the wall, scrawled in blood, was a message. Misty's not the only one who fits under your bed. Ed was extremely fond of his grandmother, Mabel, who had raised him after his parents died when he was 8 years old, but she was worried about him. She knew that he was too young to be spending all of his time with books and an old woman. Mabel prayed every night for a companion for her grandson, for she did not want to leave her Eddie alone on the earth. One morning, Ed awoke to the clamor of pouring rain outside his window. He bundled himself up, kissed Mabel goodbye, and left for the bookstore. Returning home that evening, he decided to take an alternate route to avoid the mudslides from the cliffs. As he drove, he spotted a young woman standing soaking wet at a bus stop. Ed offered to give her a ride home. She got into the car and shook off her long black hair that was dripping from the rain. "My name is Louisa," she said. She was exquisite, a raven. This nymph who had fell upon his arms enchanted Ed. They drove and talked and laughed and fell madly in love. Every day for 2 weeks, Ed would pick Louisa up at the bus stop and drive her home. Ed was completely changed. His amorous affections brought him new light. Ed was so in love that he decided he would bring Louisa home to meet his grandmother. That evening, when he got to the bus stop, she was not there. Puzzled, he drove to the house he had been dropping her off at for 2 weeks. He knocked on the door. An old woman answered in a tired voice. "What do you want?" Ed introduced himself as Louisa's Ed, the man who had been driving her home the past 2 weeks. The woman was startled, but invited Ed in the house. She invited him to sit and offered him a cup of tea. Ed asked if Louisa would be returning soon. The old woman showed Ed a picture. It was in an old frame, and the picture looked somewhat outdated. A beautiful young woman was riding a horse. "How ravishing Louisa looks!" exclaimed Ed. The old woman laid the picture down on a table and sat across from Ed. "Yes, she was very beautiful," the old woman said sadly. "What do you mean was?" questioned Ed. The old woman asked how he had met Louisa. Ed happily told her his story of rescuing Louisa from the bus stop on a rainy night. The old woman's face went blank. She put her tea down and carefully picked up the picture of Louisa. Staring at the picture, she told Ed in a crackling old voice, "It was a rainy night. Louisa was waiting for the bus, when all of a sudden, a car came skidding around the corner, out of control." The old woman paused and drew in a deep breath. She was killed that night, 30 years ago. Audrey and Jill were college students. The summer before their junior year, the girls had decided to rent a cottage together on a secluded island. A number of their friends from college were doing the same. They found an adorable little cottage nestled in a wooden area. Each cottage had a sign over the door. Their sign read, "Comfort Cottage." They got themselves waitress jobs at a local inn and spent the rest of their time partying and relaxing on the beach. Audrey's motive for escape was not as simple as Jill's. Audrey and her boyfriend AJ had decided to call it quits. Audrey did everything she could to rid her mind of AJ, but it was hopeless. She was still in love. Apparently, AJ felt the same way. He called Audrey and asked her if he could come onto the island for the weekend. He had gone home for the summer, but would fly into the city if she would come meet him and escort him back to the island. Audrey agreed. As Audrey was packing, Jill returned to the house with a dreadful sunburn. Audrey yelled in shock as she saw Jill's red, blistered body walking painfully up the wooden stairs of the cottage. She rushed to help Jill lie in the bed. Jill seemed relieved just to be off her feet. As Audrey applied the ointment over Jill's burnt body, she told her about her phone call from AJ. Audrey was hesitant to leave Jill in such a state, but Jill insisted she would be fine. She was simply going to go to sleep. Audrey reluctantly left, assuring Jill she would be back first thing in the morning to check on her. Audrey got in her car and drove off down the dirt road. The ferry was about 3 miles from their cottage, and she was already running late to catch the last one. Halfway to the ferry, Audrey realized she had left her asthma medicine back at the house. She thought for a moment, then decided she must go back for it. She drove as quickly as she could through the dense fog on those rocky cliff roads. When she got to the house, all the lights were turned off. Not wanting to disturb Jill, she quietly tiptoed into the house, leaving the lights off. She made her way to the bathroom and grabbed her inhaler and medicine. As she was leaving the house, she stopped. She sensed something. She reached over to turn on the light, but could not find the chain to pull. A small thud sounded as she knocked over a book from a table. Cursing to herself in whispers, she then paused for a moment and listened. Nothing. Deciding all was well, and not wanting to wake up Jill, she quietly hurried out the door. Audrey and AJ had an incredible night together and decided they had been foolish to break up. The next morning, Audrey insisted they catch the 6 a.m. ferry so they could get back to check on Jill. Audrey was worried about Jill's sunburn. She bought a bag full of ointments, a couple of fashion magazines, Jill's favorite junk food, and headed back to the cottage. As they got out of the car, Audrey noticed something strange. The Comfort Cottage sign had fallen off the door and was lying face down at the foot of the stairs. Audrey quickly walked up the stairs toward the door. AJ flipped over the sign. There were bloody handprints all over it. AJ examined it, not knowing what it was. Then realizing, he yelled to Audrey, who had already entered the house. A blaring screech sounded from the house. AJ ran up the stairs and threw open the screen door. He rushed through the house to the bedroom to find Jill's slain, bloody body strewn across the bed. Her sunburned arms were tied to the bedpost. AJ frantically yelled for Audrey. He ran into the bedroom to where Audrey was slumped over the sink she had just thrown up in. On the bathroom mirror, written in blood, were the words, "Just be glad you didn't turn on the light."
Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. Only this, and nothing more. Distinctly I remember, it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow, vainly I had sought to borrow from my books surcease of sorrow, sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels named Lenore, nameless here forevermore. And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before, so that now, to still the beating of my heart, I stood repeating, "'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door, some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. This it is, and nothing more." Presently my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. "Sir," said I, or "Madam, truly your forgiveness I implore, but the fact is I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping at my chamber door, that I scarce was sure I heard you. Here I opened wide the door, darkness there, and nothing more. Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there, wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word, "Lenore." This I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word "Lenore." Merely this, and nothing more. Back into the chamber turning, all my soul within me burning, soon again I heard a tapping, somewhat louder than before. "Surely," said I, "surely that is something at my window lattice. Let me see them, what thereat is, and this mystery explore. Let my heart be still a moment, and this mystery explore. 'Tis the wind, and nothing more." Open here I flung the shutter, when with many a flirt and flutter, in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not a minute stopped or stayed he, but with mien of lord or lady, perched above my chamber door, perched upon a bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, perched and sat, and nothing more. Then this ebony bird, beguiling my sad fancy into smiling by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore, "Though thy crest be shorn and shaven, thou," I said, "art sure no craven, ghastly, grim and ancient raven, wandering from the nightly shore. Tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore." Quoth the raven, "Nevermore." Much I marveled this ungainly fowl to hear discourse so plainly, though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore. For we cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door, bird or beast upon the sculptured bust above his chamber door, with such name as nevermore. But the raven, still lonely on that placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that one word he did outpour. Nothing further then he uttered, not a feather then he fluttered, till I scarcely more than muttered, "Other friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before." Then the bird said, "Nevermore." Startled at the stillness broken by reply so aptly spoken, "Doubtless," said I, "what it utters is its only stock and store, caught from some unhappy master, whose unmerciful disaster followed fast and followed faster, till his songs one burden bore, till the dirges of his hope that melancholy burden bore, of never, nevermore." But the raven, still beguiling all my fancy into smiling, straight I wheeled a cushioned seat in front of bird and bust and door. Then upon the velvet sinking, I betook myself to linking fancy unto fancy, thinking what this ominous bud of yore, what this grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt and ominous bud of yore meant in croaking nevermore. Thus I sat engaged in guessing, but no syllable expressing to the fowl whose fiery eyes now burned into my bosom's core. This and more I sat divining, with my head at ease reclining on the cushion's velvet lining that the lamplight gloated o'er, but whose velvet violet lining, with the lamplight gloating o'er, she shall press, nevermore. Then methought the air grew denser, perfumed from an unseen censer, swung by seraphim whose footfalls tinkled on the tufted floor. "Wretch," I cried, "thy God hath lent thee, by these angels he hath sent thee respite, respite and nepenthe from my memories of Lenore. Quaff, oh quaff this kind nepenthe, and forget this lost Lenore." Quoth the raven, "Nevermore." "Prophet," said I, "thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, whether tempter sent, or whether tempest tossed thee here ashore, desolate, yet all undaunted, on this desert land enchanted, on this home by horror haunted, tell me truly, I implore, is there balm in Gilead? Tell me, I implore." Quoth the raven, "Nevermore." "Prophet," said I, "thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, by that heaven that bends above us, by that God we both adore, tell this soul with sorrow laden, if within the distant Aden it shall clasp a sainted maiden, whom the angels named Lenore. Clasp a rare and radiant maiden, whom the angels named Lenore." Quoth the raven, "Nevermore." "Be that word our sign in parting, bird or fiend," I shrieked, upstarting, "get thee back into the tempest and the night's Plutonian shore. Leave no black plume as a token of that lie thy soul hath spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken. Quit the bust above my door. Take thy beak from out my heart, and take thy form from off my door." Quoth the raven, "Nevermore." And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas, just above my chamber door. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore.